Alrighty then. It does appear that we are recording, which is good. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 120. I am your host, Panyobasa, and this is my beverage, which is morning coffee. I'm actually doing this in the morning, which is unusual for me. I'm mostly an afternoon person. So, I will announce that there is an aquarium video coming up, which has almost no Dharma in it whatsoever. It's verging more over into like ecology, which I guess, Dharma applies to everything in the world. So it also applies to the ecology of fish tanks. So I guess there's that. So that'll probably be up in a few days. And it does look like I'm going to continue working in a sheet metal shop because my previous employer is very eager to hire me back. Not the most recent one, but the one before that. So still going to be driving a forklift and stuff, which is actually kind of nice. I enjoy operating a forklift. So might as well start answering these here particular questions. And the first question is from Athena's Sigil. And Athena's Sigil says, explain Abhidhamma both historically and culturally, and don't hold back. Add your criticism. I know you're up to the request. Well, yeah, actually I am. Although starting off with a meaty kind of question like this right off the bat, especially since I just woke up a little while ago, might not be ideal. But we'll give it a shot here. Abhidhamma philosophy. For those of you who don't know what Abhidhamma is, it is the third Pitaka of the Buddhist scriptures. The Buddhist scriptures are called the Tipitaka, or in Sanskrit, the Tripitaka, which literally means three baskets. First basket is Vinaya, or rules of monastic discipline. Second is Sutta, or Suttanta, which is the discourses of the Buddha with regard to philosophy and meditation and so forth. And third is Abhidhamma, or in Sanskrit, Abhidharma. And originally, Abhidhamma, it's mentioned a few times in the text, but it's also often, if not usually, paired with Abhivinaya. So you've got a sutta where the monks are sitting around, usually with the Buddha not there, it's just some monks sitting around discussing Dhamma and so forth. And they will discuss Abhidhamma and Abhivinaya. Which, generally what it originally meant, apparently, is like higher points, finer points of Dhamma and finer points of Vinaya, which is the first two Pitakas, essentially. Dhamma is just like the theory, and Vinaya is like the practice, roughly speaking. So originally, Abhidhamma just meant like finer points of Dhamma, and then it got turned into what are sometimes called the matrices or the matrices, which are like lists of points. It was like sort of like a synopsis of Dhamma, sort of like I wouldn't say a catechism, but just sort of like the basic points in like systematic form. That was like a learning aid, like in very ancient times, still in India, of course. And eventually it started like diversifying. It started growing and evolving into a whole other Pitaka, a whole other branch of Buddhist philosophy, which attempts to explain everything. And this was actually pretty much in vogue in ancient India, ancient northern India, like the Ganges Valley. There were even like some proto-Hindu schools, like the Nyaya school. There was another one, I can't remember the name of it, but there was Nyaya and another school of within the Vedic traditions that were trying to do the same thing as Buddhist Abhidhamma, which is trying to categorize and explain everything in the universe. So it was sort of like an attempt at Aristotelian physics, or what science is trying to do in modern times, just trying to explain the entire phenomenal universe. empirically, objectively. And so it was just in vogue in northern India in ancient times, and the Buddhists were not immune to that vogue. And so the different schools of ancient Indian Buddhism, most of the ancient schools, with one notable exception, started coming up with their own philosophical interpretation of Dhamma and trying to explain everything in accordance with that interpretation, and that became their Abhidhamma or their Abhidharma. And it's fairly clear that it doesn't go all the way back to the time of the Buddha. According to the original, like the traditional explanation of Abhidhamma, the Buddha didn't teach it on this planet. What happened was, during one rains retreat, the Buddha just sort of manifested a kind of holographic image of himself on this earth. We won't get into the question of whether that is ethical in deliberately deceiving people into thinking that he was really there when he wasn't. And then he flew or levitated or teleported up into, I can't remember which heaven it was. It was either Tawatimsa or Tusita heaven, where his mother was. His mother was now a goddess living in this sort of medium rank heaven world, and he was teaching this philosophy to her and the other gods, small g gods and goddesses there. And then he was sending a kind of synopsis of that. It's like review notes back down to earth through, I think it was Mahamoggallana, one of his chief disciples, was like coming back down to earth with these notes from the Buddha's sermons or lectures on the nature of ultimate reality up in heaven. And then it was the end of the rains retreat when the Buddha descended this like miraculously manifested staircase from heaven back down to earth. And so in Burma, the last day of the rains retreat is called Abhidhamma Day, because that's the day that the Buddha came back down to earth after teaching Abhidhamma in heaven. And it's fairly clear that this is a kind of rationalization for explaining how all of a sudden new, genuine, authentic teachings of the Buddha that nobody had heard of before, all of a sudden are being declared genuine, authentic teachings of the Buddha. It's like, well, he didn't teach it on this planet, that's true, but he taught it up in heaven, and then it got brought down to us, and now we're finding out about it. So Abhidhamma, the Abhidhamma Pitaka, I mean, when it becomes canonical in Theravada Buddhism, it probably did not become canonical until the third council, which was during the reign of the Emperor Ashoka. So this would be approximately 200 years after the time of the Buddha. And there's some evidence for that. I mean, I could have, maybe I should, just a second. I gotta get a book. Okay. See, when I was in Burma, I was really down on Abhidhamma because the Burmese consider Abhidhamma to be the highest, the most important teachings of the Buddha, when from a historical, empirical point of view, probably the Buddha didn't even really teach it. And so I spent a lot more time, let's see, oh, maybe it's not even here. Wrong book, never mind. But I spent a lot of time when I was in Burma, a monk in Burma, this kind of bashing Abhidhamma, you know, like a common insult to another Western monk might be, your mother was an Abhidhamma scholar, that kind of thing. So anyways, I forgot the strand of thought that I was working on, which is pretty common with me. But so there are some bits of evidence that Abhidhamma really is not early. And one of them is that one of the books of the Abhidhamma Pitaka is the Kata Watu, which is third or fourth on the list of 7 texts that are canonical Abhidhamma texts in Theravada Buddhism. And the Kata Watu, the whole purpose of the Kata Watu, or grounds of debate, it could be interpreted, like translated into like grounds for debate, is giving the Theravadins arguments against the other schools of Buddhism with regard to philosophy. So like the Sarvastivada school had this tenet in their philosophy that past, present, and future all exist in a sense simultaneously, kind of like an Einsteinian interpretation of time, whereas the Theravadan Abhidhamma had a more Newtonian interpretation of time, where only the present moment exists, past doesn't exist, future doesn't exist, only the present moment exists. So in the Kata Watu, which was presumably edited, if not composed, by a certain monk named Moggali Puttatissa, who was like the chairperson, like the leader of the Third Council. That it's like telling you how to argue against these heretical, pernicious, wrong views of the other schools of Buddhism. And it's hardly likely the Buddha would have actually taught how to debate against other schools of Buddhism, when, of course, in the Buddhist time, there were no other schools of Buddhism. And also, there are plenty of texts that discourage debate, like the Pasura Sutta of the Sutta Nipata. So that's one bit of evidence that obviously one of the 7 books of Abhidhamma is just plainly anachronistic, because it applies to the state of Buddhism during the time of the Emperor Ashoka rather than the time of Gautama Buddha himself. Also, one of the main arguments against the authenticity of Abhidhamma is that every school of Buddhism, like I was saying before, every school of Buddhism had its own Abhidhamma. Even Theravada and Sarvastivada, which are very close. In fact, the main purpose of the Third Council apparently was to purge the Sarvastivadins from the Theravada school. So Sarvastivada and Theravada were within the same tradition, like Stavira, Proto-Theravada, up until the Third Council during the time of the Emperor Ashoka. And it was like one of the main purposes was to establish this is orthodox Buddhism from our point of view, and this other branch, this other like rival philosophical school that is still contained within the tradition is kicked out. And if you read the ancient chronicles of Theravada Buddhism, it says essentially that non-Buddhist heretics had infiltrated the Sangha, and the purpose of the Third Council was to kick out these non-Buddhist heretics, when in all likelihood it was the Sarvastivadins, the Sarvastivadin branch of this philosophic Buddhist philosophy were being kicked out. So even the Sarvastivadins and the Theravadins had entirely different Abhidhammas. Not a single text is the same. So every single school of these ancient Abhidhammas were completely different. So that also is very good evidence that Abhidhamma did not originate with the Buddha, but was cooked up in later centuries, just due to this ancient Indian need or fashion for just trying to systematize and categorically explain everything. And they still failed. Like I mentioned, I think it was the previous Q&A, that Pali Theravadan Abhidhamma tries to explain the entire universe, but for some reason they don't include gravity. Gravity is not included. It's not one of the 4 forces or anything like that, like in modern science. It was just assumed, and they didn't explain this either, but it was just assumed in ancient Abhidhamma philosophy, or ancient Indian cosmology for that matter, that the entire universe has the same up-down orientation. That there was just kind of no gravity, or gravity was just kind of built into space because there was just this automatic orientation of up and down throughout the universe. And it doesn't really work that way. So it's in the devout Theravada Buddhists, like in Burma, for example, very dogmatic, very like medieval in their faith-based approach to Buddhism. It all has to be correct. Everything in the scriptures has to be 100% true. That if you point out to them that all the other ancient schools had their own different Abhidhammas, that they'll say, well, they were heretics, they had wrong view, they rejected the true Abhidhamma and then just invented this fake Abhidhamma from scratch, which, it's common among any religion to assume that your own religion is the one true one, and that other religions are often just evil people who are deliberately embracing what they deep down know is wrong. Like the Book of Mormon is full of this. Anyone who wasn't a Mormon in the Book of Mormon, anyone who didn't follow what the Book of Mormon is teaching, they were doing it just deliberately out of just stubborn, bloody mindedness. They knew that what the Mormons were following was true, and still just out of just pernicious evil, they rejected it. And it's just very difficult for me to believe that that's the way it is. I know for a fact that that's not the way it is. Not necessarily with regard to the Book of Mormon, because I think the Book of Mormon is almost entirely fiction. So another bit of evidence that Abhidhamma is not 100% correct. And in my books, there is some bashing of Abhidhamma. You can find it in my books, which are for sale on Amazon. You can find it in the URL links below. But that some of the most important teachings of Abhidhamma, like there's a text called the Abhidhammata Sangha, which is in Burma is considered more important than the Pali texts themselves, because it's like a summary of the teachings of Abhidhamma, and some of the most important aspects of Abhidhamma that are taught in courses on Abhidhamma and so forth aren't even found in the text. It's all commentarial stuff, because at the time that the Tipitaka was finalized, Abhidhamma philosophy still wasn't finished yet. And so they had to keep adding to it after the Tipitaka was finished. You couldn't add more books to the Tipitaka at that point, or add more texts, or, it was pretty much all memorized at the time. So, they just had to include it in the commentaries. So certain things like Rupa Kalapas, which are like these molecules that the universe is made of, it's basic to Abhidhamma philosophy only in the texts, or only in the commentaries. Or the Chitta Viti, which is this sequence, if I remember correctly, it's 17 mind moments per each. It's like 17 events that happen for each mind moment. For like, if you're going to perceive something, it takes these 17 mind moments in sequence. And it starts with Bhavanga Chitta, and it goes through these different stages of, like averting the attention and all this kind of stuff. That also is found only in the commentarial tradition, and not in the Pali texts, like the canonical Pali texts themselves. So it's fairly clear that Abhidhamma was not really taught by the Buddha. Like some of his teachings are represented in that, but Abhidhamma just tries to explain ultimate reality. And they're even considering samsara to be ultimately real. In Abhidhamma, you got four main ultimate realities. You've got mind, mental states, matter, and nibbana. And there's 28 different kinds of matter. There's 52 different kinds of mental states. And so you've got this broad spectrum of all these different ultimate realities. And so according to Abhidhamma, like traditional orthodox Abhidhamma, which includes the commentarial tradition, that nose sensitivity or femininity or earth element are all just as ultimately real as nibbana or nirvana itself. And I think they just completely missed the boat. And I would agree with the English monk Jnanavira, who lived like he was a monk in the 50s and first half of the 60s in Sri Lanka, who rejected Abhidhamma. He considered it just to be just bogus. And he would say, you're better off not learning any Abhidhamma, because that means there's less that you have to unlearn in order to really understand Dhamma. So I bashed Abhidhamma a lot when I was a monk in Burma. And then when I came back to America, Nobody gave a shit about Abhidhamma. Nobody really gave a shit about even like authenticity in the texts, really. That they were more interested in like scientism. That, you know, when I came back to the West, one of the main shockers, I think, was that most Westerners who call themselves Buddhist really adopt scientific realism as their metaphysic, their interpretation of reality, and then just try to superimpose some Dhamma, especially the ethical aspects, on top of that. And so then I started bashing scientism and pretty much stopped bashing Abhidhamma because there was no point to it. So I guess that's enough. I mean, there's quite a few questions. There's less than 40 this time, but more than 30. So I guess that's good enough. I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And Fred says, what's your thoughts on Daniel Ingram claiming arahantship? I haven't watched his videos yet. Well, I only watched part of one video from Daniel Ingram, but my mind was already kind of poisoned against him before I ever saw him on YouTube. And that was, I did look at his website years ago. People were asking me about Daniel Ingram years and years ago, back when I was still a monk. And you look on his website, I don't know if it's still like this now, but he's like advertising himself as an arahant, as a fully enlightened being on his website. And he's got this list of accomplishments where he has mastered all these jhanas and like superhuman states and so forth. And I mean, I really don't think a fully enlightened being is really just going to be bragging and just advertising how enlightened he is. That's one thing that from the very beginning, when I first started reading the suttas, when the Buddha is just bragging about how great he is and how people should worship him and so forth, I was just thinking an enlightened being is very hardly likely to say this kind of stuff. So it sort of planted the seed of really doubting the authenticity and genuineness of many Pali texts. Because I really do not think that a person who has transcended self-view, who no longer really identifies with an ego, who no longer identifies as anything, is just going to be bragging, advertising how great he is. So, yeah, I was always skeptical of Daniel Ingram. There are a lot of like sociopaths or con men out there trying to pass themselves off as fully enlightened. And also there are a bunch of people out there who have some kind of experience in their meditation, and then they think, bam, that's it, I must be enlightened now. At very least, I'm a Sotapanna. I mean, that's pretty common. You got like the person who really wants to make progress in Dhamma, and then they have some kind of breakthrough in their meditation. You know, they see lots of, you know, bright lights and fireworks, and they have some kind of insight that arises, and so then they just latch onto this idea that they're enlightened now. So not anyone who tries to pass themselves off as enlightened that really isn't enlightened is necessarily a con man. Some of them have just fooled themselves into thinking that they're fully enlightened. Like, for example, there's the famous sutta in the Udana, the Bahya Sutta. It's one of my favorite suttas in the texts, and it's about this non-Buddhist ascetic philosopher named Bahya, who is getting a lot of respect from people. He's made some significant progress in Dhamma. And so he starts thinking, wow, maybe I really am enlightened. And then some small g god, some deity who used to be a friend or kinsman of Bahya in a previous life comes down to him and says, no, you're not enlightened. But there is an enlightened being called the Buddha who lives, you know, over in the kingdom of Kosala. And so then Bahya goes and meets the Buddha because he had enough wisdom to accept this admonishment from the small g god, from this deva, that he wasn't really enlightened. But still, it is possible that some people can have some kind of experience or whatever it is that causes them to think that they're enlightened when really they are not. And I'm not sure which one it is with Daniel Ingram. I personally am skeptical that he really is enlightened. I finally saw him on a YouTube video, and he seemed like kind of nervous and fidgety, and I don't know, he just did not come off as an enlightened being to me at all, although that could just be preconceptions on my part. And those of you who have watched a lot of my Q&A videos may know that I'm just skeptical of the idea that within a samsaric context, you really can have enlightened beings anyway. That an enlightened being is a kind of paradox. So if it's a paradox that doesn't follow the rules, then really it's like, no rules apply and you can't really say much about the situation. And it could be like a lot of people, a lot of Mahayana Buddhists anyway, Eckhart Tolle, saying, we're all already enlightened. It's just that we don't realize it yet somehow. But the enlightenment is already there. So it could be that Daniel Ingram just had a flash of insight into that and would like to believe that he's enlightened, or it could be that he's just like a con man, just wanting to be famous and make money and so forth from this reputation of being fully enlightened. Or, I cannot entirely rule out the possibility that he really is enlightened, in which case what Buddhism says about what enlightened beings are like is all false, or a lot of it is false. So I'm personally fairly skeptical, and have been for many years, with regard to Daniel Ingram, largely because of him just bragging, advertising that he's this enlightened being who has mastered this, and this. It's all on page 1 of his website, or at least it used to be. So, yeah, there's a lot of people like that out there, and there's another person mentioned in one of the questions below, I have noticed, that's along these lines also. So I'm just going to move on to Fred's second question. Is draining the spuds really wicked? The body has fluid it would normally spew out at some stage. Well, I wouldn't call it wicked. It's like, of course, he's talking about, emission of semen. And just the physiological act itself is ethically neutral, that it's not even condemned in the Pali text. For example, in the rule, the Sanghadisesa rule, it's number 1, Sanghadisesa number 1. In the rules of monastic discipline, it says a monk is not allowed to deliberately emit semen and deliberately have an orgasm unless it's in a dream. And when I was a younger monk and still full of juice, about every 2 weeks on average, you'd have like a pornographic dream that would then, restore your hormonal equilibrium, so to speak. So just the physiological act of causing an orgasm deliberately, or not deliberately, just the physiological act of having an orgasm is ethically neutral. But if you're trying to have an orgasm on purpose, then you're wallowing in sensuality, which is got a certain amount of unwholesome karma associated with it. And then if you're a monk and you have agreed through your ordination that you're not going to do that kind of stuff, you're going to follow the Vinaya rules, then there's also some additional like unwholesome karma for a monk, because not only is he wallowing in sensuality to some degree, but also he's knowingly and willingly breaking these rules. And it's a fairly serious rule. Sanghadisesa rules require 6 days and 6 nights of penance. And I've noticed there's a question about that also down below. So, yeah, even then it's not really wicked. Some teenage boy jerking off to pornography or something, or older person jerking off to pornography, then, there's a certain amount of unskillful karma involved. But I wouldn't go so far as to call it wicked or evil. It's unskillful to some degree from a strictly ancient Indian ascetic dharmic point of view, in which all kinds of things are immoral from the ancient Indian ascetic point of view. Just putting salt and pepper on your food to make it taste better is still, you're wallowing in sensuality. It's not good. You shouldn't do it. Listening to music, liking music, that kind of stuff, wallowing in sensuality. The ancient Indian Buddhist ethic was very austere, and you should not pursue any kind of sensual pleasure other than what is absolutely necessary, like eating food in general, sleeping, bathing, that kind of thing. That's about it. So, yeah, my experience was that when I was celibate and not deliberately causing orgasms, then every few weeks when I was younger, it would just like the hormonal pressure would build up until finally I would just emit in my sleep. And then when I reached about 42 years of age, when I was in my early 40s, it stopped happening. And I missed it, actually, because some of those dreams were pretty hot, I have to admit. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to Fred's next question, which is, was Muhammad an immoral man? Well, this is kind of a controversial one. And from a Muslim point of view, Muhammad was not an immoral man. He was the perfect man. You know, he was the ideal. He's the role model. But from a Buddhist point of view, obviously Muhammad was an immoral man because he killed people. He raped women. He sold women and children into slavery. He was a pirate, essentially. I mean, and this is all from the Muslim texts themselves. You know, it's not like non-Muslims are making this stuff up against him. It's just right there in their own tradition that, for example, when Muhammad moved to Medina from Mecca, you know, he was driven out of Mecca. He was not popular there. He moved to Medina, and he didn't really have property there that he and his followers could like profit from. And so he had to come up with some other way of supporting himself and his followers. So they started doing essentially bandit raids on caravans, which involved killing people sometimes. And it's stealing. You know, he's like killing people and taking their stuff. I mean, from a Buddhist point of view, that is just flat out immoral. That's about as immoral as you can get. And then also, I mean, there's cases that the Muslims admit to themselves where he would kill somebody in like some little war. They weren't very big wars during his time. The wars got much bigger after he died. And then he'd be like having sex with this dead man's wife, you know, 50 feet away from her dead husband's body. So, yeah, he was a very immoral man, like a murderer, a thief, a bandit, a warlord, essentially. So he was much closer as spiritual leaders go. He was much closer to Moses, assuming that Moses ever really existed. There must have been at least one person upon which the legend of Moses was based. And I mean, Moses was a warlord. It's kind of ironic that like Hebrew people nowadays really have a dim view of the whole idea of genocide. But as far as I know, the first recorded attempt at genocide is in the Old Testament, where Moses was commanding that all Canaanites be exterminated. Every man, woman, and child, even the dogs and donkeys and stuff in some cases. So Muhammad comes much closer to Moses than he comes to the Buddha or Jesus. The Buddha and Jesus apparently were like very moral people. You know, they were saintly people, whereas Muhammad and Moses, assuming again that Moses ever really existed, they were essentially warlords who used religion as a way of getting their supporters more fanatical in their support, unifying the people, getting as just fanatically obedient. And whether it was sincere or whether it was getting back more into the con man stuff, who knows? But I already answered that question. The main question anyway, was Muhammad an immoral man? Depends on what tradition you're following, I guess. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, have you ever met an enlightened being, and what was he like? Well, I've answered this question a couple of times, I think, over the course of these Q&As. So I would advise anyone, before you ask a question, watch all 119 of the previous Q&As, and then there's a good chance your question will already be answered there. But here we are, and here's the question. And again, I already mentioned just a few minutes ago that I am skeptical of the very possibility of a really fully enlightened being living within a samsaric context. Like an unenlightened person, when an unenlightened person looks at another being, they're looking at them through unenlightenment colored glasses. So an unenlightened person, they're not going to really be able to perceive an enlightened being. They'll perceive some saintly person, and then they'll have this unenlightened idea of what enlightenment is like, what an enlightened being is like, and then they'll just project that onto the other person, which is one reason why you've got so many fake enlightened beings in this world. People who are considered to be enlightened beings who aren't. So with that as a kind of introduction or disclaimer, have I ever met an enlightened being and what was he like? As I've said before, the one person that I've met that maybe had the best plausible claim for being enlightened was Shwe Umin Seato in Burma, and I only met him for a few minutes. And I was staying at a monastery called Thabet Ain Doya in Mon State in southern Burma, and Shwe Umin Seato would spend his summers at a monastery that was maybe 5 miles away on a different hill. And so I was told that Shwe Umin Seato was going to be there, and I, of course, wanted to meet him. So a layperson walked me there, and it was during the hot season in southern Burma, just hot and humid. I was completely drenched in sweat. My robes were just wet with sweat by the time I got there. And I'm sitting there just sweating and just kind of very uncomfortable. And Shwe Umin Seato and this other old Seato, he was very old. Shwe Umin Seato also had to have been probably at least 80 at the time. And this other old monk was probably older than Shwe Umin Seato. And the difference between those two old Burmese monks was like night and day, because this one old monk who was with Shwe Umin Seato, he was out of it. I mean, he obviously had severe cognitive decline. He was almost deaf. People would have to yell into his ear. And even then, it was questionable whether he really was able to hear it or understand what was being said. I mean, he was really senile. And Shwe Umin Seato was just kind of sitting straight up and down, just bright-eyed, just kind of looking right through you. And I mean, that's really all I was exposed to with regard to Shwe Umin Seato. I've spoken with other monks, both Western and Burmese, who knew him way better than I did. And like, I used to know this retired surgeon who was ordained as a monk after he retired from being this kind of upper class sort of surgeon. And he said that of all the monks that he ever met, that he thought had the greatest claim for being enlightenment would be the one that he considered to be the most likely was Webu Seato. But Webu Seato died back in like the 1970s, I think. And so of the ones that were still alive at that time, this was like the late 90s that I was talking with him, he said Shwe Umin Seato probably would be the one that he would consider to be enlightened if he had to guess that, you know, any monks were enlightened, because just having a reputation for being enlightened doesn't really mean very much. And I had an American friend, still have him as a friend, in fact, pretty sure, who was a disciple for a short time, I think, of Shwe Umin Seato. And he said Shwe Umin Seato could definitely read minds. You know, he would just be talking to one person and then just like break off and start addressing what this other person was thinking about, and then go back to his main conversation, you know. So, yeah, with regard to what he was like from my point of view, I mean, he was just sitting straight up and down, very bright-eyed, very alert and attentive. And that was really it, because I only was there with him, you know, had a very brief audience with him for a few minutes. And then I was off. I went back to the Thabet Ain Doya. So I'm just going to move on to Philalethes' next question, which is, how do you justify holding political views when the Buddha explicitly tells us not to have views and considers politics animal talk? Don't worry, I'm not being contentious here, or if I am, then I apologize, but I was just thinking that whatever your justification for being a Trump supporter is, speaking not a Democrat, but as someone who's fairly apolitical, it would impart some wisdom unto us lowly spiritual peons. Well, I'm no longer a renunciant. I am now a tax-paying citizen of the United States. I am a householder. I've got a woman. I've got bills to pay, and I vote. It's like in a democracy, it's the duty of a citizen to participate in the political process, at least to the extent of being aware of what the political situation is, so that you can vote knowledgeably and justly in the elections. It's the duty of an American citizen who hasn't renounced the world to participate to some degree. So the Buddha discouraged discussing politics, but he also discouraged living in a house. He discouraged handling money. He discouraged having a mate. So, that applies to hardcore renunciants, people who really are radically renouncing society, but I'm no longer radically renouncing society. And so I do take an interest in politics, and I do speak about my interest in politics from time to time. But from the point of view of an American citizen, it really is your duty to have some political awareness. And it's a very interesting subject. Yeah, it's very interesting, especially lately. The whole Trump phenomenon has radically transformed the political situation in America and indirectly to the rest of the Western world. Just because the whole globalist uniparty in America has been overthrown. Now the remnant of the globalist uniparty is the Democrat plus a few vestigial neocon conservatives in the Republican Party. And they're being purged gradually. So it's interesting times from a political point of view. It's so damn interesting. It's hard for me not to talk about it sometimes. So anyways, I guess that's good enough of an answer. So I'm just going to move on to Philalethes' third question, which is as follows. Mechanical or mechanized behavior, for example, repetitive mindless behaviors like having stock answers for everything, is waking death and a path to whatever can be called hell, and is a form of suppressing what Mahayanists call Buddha nature. Agree or disagree? I would disagree, partly because it depends on your attitude. It's not the outward behavior, mechanical or mechanized behavior, like you're working at a machine. It's just repetitive behavior. You're like sticking something into one end of a machine or taking it out of the other end of the machine and putting it into a crate or something. That can be a kind of mindless zombie-like behavior, or it could be like a meditative experience. Like when you're practicing meditation, mindfulness of breathing. How mechanical or repetitive can you get than just watching the sensation of touch at your nostrils as the air goes in and out? Or you're doing walking meditation. It's just, left foot, right foot, and just, it's just whatever it is that you're observing. It's just this mechanical process, and you're not even being creative, really. There's hardly any originality involved. So, I don't think it's really a path to hell either. It's more of a path to let's just say that you're just kind of zoning out. You just kind of go into this semi-conscious stupor when you're running the machine or when you're sitting there breathing. It's not that you're in a heightened state of awareness. You're just in a semi-conscious stupor, just mechanically zombie-like doing what you're doing. Even that I don't think would be a road to hell so much as a road to a ghost realm where you're only halfway there. You're just, my experience with seances and, spirit phenomena and so forth is that they tend not to be fully conscious. It's like they're sleepwalking, these kind of beings. So, I mean, it would be more of a road towards that, or possibly even a kind of animal existence, a kind of mindless animal existence, than actually going to hell, because you have to do something bad to go to hell. And just like being in a semi-conscious stupor is not necessarily wicked or evil. But I do agree that, like, repetitive, having stock answers for everything. A lot of Burmese Seattles are like this, where you ask a question and they've got like a standard stock list of like 40 questions that they know how to answer, like 40 answers. And they'll just pick the one that most closely resembles the answer to your question. It might not even really be answering your question, but it's the closest one that they have memorized and they're comfortable with. Yeah, I mean, even that's not a road to hell, but you're not fully awake. You're not fully conscious, especially with regard to like having stock answers for everything. That just being a dogmatist who's maybe just afraid to have their own opinion out of fear of like heresy, of giving the wrong answer, because the Burmese Buddhists in general, not all of them, but most of them, are pretty much like medieval European Catholics, where it's all dogma and you're afraid to deviate from that because that's heresy and you can go to hell for it. So, let's see, let's just review this question here. Mechanical or mechanized behavior, for example, repetitive mindless behaviors like having stock answers for everything, is walking death. Yeah, it's like walking semi-consciousness, it's like sleepwalking more than walking death. And a path to whatever can be called hell, yeah, I've already discussed how I think it's more like the Peta realm, the ghost realm, or maybe animal realm, than hell. And as a form of suppressing what Mahayanas call Buddha nature, I don't know if it's so much suppressing it as just concealing it, just covering it over. Yeah, obscuring it might be better than suppressing it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Quaesitor. And Quaesitor has radically transgressed the rule of 3 questions per episode, because he has asked a total of 6 questions. And I'm just saying, I mean, when Donald Trump gets into office and establishes his fascist regime, Quaesitor, with 6 questions like this, can easily lined up against the wall. And shot, although not with anything lethal, something that might sting a little bit, a BB gun or something. I mean, we don't want to get too crazy here. So Quaesitor, I'm just going to answer like the 3 first ones he asked, or it might just be the 3 meatiest, most interesting ones or something. So, I mean, he asked, he asked that if all experience is to be had only through the khandhas. I'm not answering that one because it's too many. Moving from 4th jhana to the deathless. And then he asked another question about Sotapanna stage, which indicates he's not really familiar with my understanding of what Sotapannas are. But we're not even going to go there. He can ask those questions for the next episode if he so chooses. So Quaesitor's first answer here, or question, I'm giving the answers. At least I'm trying to. Quaesitor's first question here is, if you share merit knowing that you can't actually share merit, is that a form of wrong speech? And it's just a manner of speaking. I mean, you really can't share merit from a Theravada Buddhist point of view. Maybe in Mahayana, where there's an idea of direct transmission or something, or in Hinduism, where you've got like gurus and swamis who are actually like manipulating or altering the karma of their disciples. Like Neem Karoli Baba up there, he did it through food, where he could somehow burn off your karma by eating food that you offered to him. And Ram Dass mentioned there was another kind of swami, holy man in India, who did it through cigarettes. People would donate cigarettes to him. He'd be smoking like 3 cigarettes at a time. I don't know if he died of emphysema or not, but it was like burning off the karma of his disciples by smoking the cigarettes that they offered to him. And that is not a thing in Theravada. From the Theravada Buddhist point of view, that is not really possible. Or it could be through some loophole, through the back door somehow. But as a general rule, it's not considered to be a thing in Theravada Buddhism. So you can't really share your own merit. The way sharing merit works is you perform a good deed and other beings nearby who are aware of you doing this good deed can experience mudita, or joy at your benefit. They're happy that you did this good thing, and then that is their own wholesome mental state, which then creates their own karma, their own wholesome karma, their good karma. And so a lot of the time, like Burmese Buddhists, after they do some meritorious deed, like offering robes to a monk and taking the precepts and so forth, they'll do this water pouring ceremony, which starts off with them yelling, "Amya, amya, amya," and they're gradually pouring the water into a bowl or something. And that is their way of sharing merit. It's like they're calling attention to their sharing of merit, so that beings that might not have been paying attention will start paying attention, like whether they're deities or in the ghost realm or just people standing off at a kind of a distance. Then they'll start paying attention, and then it increases the odds that these onlookers will then rejoice in the merit of this devout Buddhist person who just did this more meritorious deed. And they're rejoicing not the deed of the other person, but they're rejoicing at that other person's deed is what is their own wholesome karma and causes them to get their own good karma. So if you share merit knowing that you can't actually share merit, is that a form of wrong speech? No, I mean, you can call cheesecake knowing full well that it's not cake at all, it is pie. And I mean, it's not like you're making any, not like you're lying by calling it cheesecake. Or a starfish. I mean, a starfish isn't a star and it's not a fish either. But you're not lying when you call it a starfish. You call it like an asteroid echinoderm. An asteroid not in the sense of the rock in space, but just star-like, star-shaped. So it's just a manner of speaking. It's conventional speech. Samuti Sacha, it's conventional truth. And so, I mean, if you're trying to deceive somebody, it depends on your intention. If you're trying to actually deceive somebody into thinking you're sharing merit when you're really not. Let's say you're some high-profile Dharma teacher who's advertising that you can share merit for a small fee kind of a thing, and people think you can really share merit and you know that you can't, then yeah, that would be a kind of wrong speech, also wrong livelihood. But just using manners of speech that, you can continue calling cheesecake cake when really it is pie. And it's not like you're a liar and you're going to burn in hell for calling it cheesecake. So I'm just going to move on to Quesator's next question here, which is, you mentioned that most people don't even want to be enlightened, but isn't that just out of ignorance? If they were to experience Nibbana, they'd have something to aim for. I wonder if those that believe they want enlightenment actually understand what it is. I think that the higher jhanas would at least need to be experienced to get some idea of what to expect. So, I mean, the main question here is, you mentioned that most people don't even want to be enlightened, but isn't that just out of ignorance? Well, yeah, of course. I mean, if there wasn't any ignorance, they'd already be enlightened. So, yeah, it's you think that your ignorance, your delusion is the reality. You don't want anything beyond that. That's kind of scary. You'll have to let go of what you consider to be reality, what you consider to be yourself. And in a way, it's just like jumping off a cliff or just jumping out of an airplane or something. It's scary, even to most Buddhist monks, I think. I've mentioned before that if somehow someone invented an enlightenment pill, which would probably be red, the red enlightenment pill. And if you took this pill, you're guaranteed a full enlightenment. I think a lot of even Buddhist monks would run from that pill in terror, as though it were a rabid demon-possessed cobra. Because we are attached to what we consider to be reality, what we consider to be ourselves, and to lose that would be like death. And fear of death is just hardwired right into pretty much all beings intelligent enough to have any kind of perception at all. So let's see here. If they were to experience Nibbana, they'd have something to aim for. But if they experienced Nibbana, I mean, they wouldn't have to aim anymore. I wonder if those that believe they want enlightenment actually understand what it is. Nobody does. If you're not enlightened, you're not going to know what enlightenment is. If you have not experienced ultimate reality, you don't know what ultimate reality is. And any idea you have about what it is going to be unrealistic. It's going to be false. It's going to be invalid. Excuse me. Having to like burp or something in mid-rant is somewhat uncomfortable. So he says here, I think that the higher jhanas would at least need to be experienced to get some idea of what to expect. I mean, maybe to some degree, although it's not this idea of what enlightenment is like that helps you get enlightened. I mean, it can be helpful, but a lot of people become enlightened just out of the blue. You know, like Eckhart Tolle. I'm not insisting that he really was enlightened, but he had some kind of awakening experience anyway. And he didn't have any idea of enlightenment before that. It was just that he experienced such a state of emotional crisis that it just slammed him out of his like habitual way of looking at reality into a higher way of looking at reality. So that's the way it generally happens to Westerners, especially. That, I mean, it's just, you have some kind of insight that you weren't expecting through meditation or through a near-death experience or something. And it just, you know, it's just out of the blue. I mean, you can't really get an approximation of enlightenment other than maybe through like the higher jhanas that will at least give you a kind of flat calm mentally so that you're not distracted by all the waves. And then you can sort of get an insight into what, not being distracted by the waves is like. Because the waves are samsara. The waves are like the phenomenal so-called reality that we're stuck in. We're stuck at the level of form and not the level of essence. So I guess I answered the main question here. Isn't that just out of ignorance that people don't want to be enlightened? Well, obviously. And I mean, even if they had some fairly useful, still invalid, but at least kind of useful and orthodox interpretation of what enlightenment is like, they'd still be afraid of it because they're just locked into this essentially delusional reality, this delusional world with this delusional self. And they're so invested in that, so attached to that, that if you became enlightened, you'd have to let go of all that, and then it would be like death for them. So I'm just going to move on to Quaesitor's third question, which is referring to the simile of the raft used to get across the river. We use the Dhamma to cross samsara, but when we reach the other shore, we discard the raft. Does this translate to experiencing the fourth jhana during everyday life in non-activity and then discarding that to reach nibbana? Not necessarily. I mean, it could include that, I suppose. Although you're not going to be in fourth jhana like when you're walking around talking, not that I'm aware of. I mean, that's like a flat calm mentally, so you wouldn't be perceiving. I mean, if you perceive anything in fourth jhana, it's just like subliminal, just like bare minimum, the slightest ripples on the surface. And I mean, it could be through some paradox that a being who is like that, whose mind is like blank almost, like just like glass, can still like walk around and like order something at a restaurant, carry on a conversation, drive a car, that kind of thing. I think Orthodox Theravada would say, no, you can't do that. Although Who knows? But the simile of the raft is just practice in general, Dhamma in general, not just even just practice, but the theory. In fact, it's more the theory than the practice that is this raft made of rubbish. The standard simile, which is found in I think it's the Alagadupama Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, is, there's a man standing at the shore of this flood or some flooded river. And he wants to get to the other side. There's no boat. There's no bridge. So he just gets a bunch of sticks and branches and tying it together with vines. There's grass on it and so forth. It's just a bunch of debris he finds on this side of the river, and he lashes it together into a kind of raft or float. He gets on that, and then he just paddles that across the flood. And when he gets to the other side, he just lets it go. He doesn't just pick it up and carry it on his head and continue on his way carrying this raft. He just lets it go. He beaches it, or he just pushes it out into the water and lets it float away because he doesn't need it anymore. And that's what the Buddha was teaching with regard to Dhamma. And it's a very profound teaching that a lot of Buddhists really don't understand, that this Dhamma that they consider to be sacred and holy is essentially useful rubbish. And once you get enlightenment, it's not necessary anymore. It's just rubbish. So you have to let it go. And it's mainly these beliefs that we have about Dhamma. The practice itself is just physiological actions that, you can still continue behaving in a saintly manner. It's just that you don't have any attachment to it. You don't have any attitude towards it. It's just what you do spontaneously at this point. But all these, the Noble Eightfold Path, all these thinking about how to get to enlightenment and everything, it's not necessary anymore. You just let it go. And just beliefs in general, you let those go, because beliefs are just delusional symbols in our mind that we cling on to because we really don't know anything better, because we're not enlightened yet. So, yeah, it's not just that you're letting go of fourth jhana. You're letting go of the entire philosophical system, because the entire philosophical system is just symbolic thoughts in samsara. You don't need symbolic thoughts in samsara anymore, so you can just let all of that go. And it's not even you letting it go, because the whole idea of you is also let go of. So, skipping over the next 3 questions from Quaesitor, who is very transgressive in this Q&A. I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam. And Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, says, would a rag-wearing monk clean the rags before stitching them into a robe? I'm thinking there would be a risk of infection if there were a cut or sore in contact with dirty rags. And sure, yeah, you wash the rags. Like, you got a monk who's doing the Pamsukula Dutanga. Pamsukula literally means dust heap, garbage heap. And so in Burmese, a rag robe like this is called Pantaku, coming from Pamsukula. And so in the Buddhist time, early on in the Buddha's dispensation, that's how monks would get their robe cloth. They weren't allowed to accept cloth from lay people yet in the early days. And so they just wander around and pick up rags. They'd wash the rags, and then they'd cut them into the proper shapes and sew them together into this patchwork kind of robe. And one of the main kinds of rags that you could use would be burial shrouds, or shrouds at what is called a charnel field, where people that were too poor to get a decent burial or cremation would just be thrown out into this field to be devoured by insects and vultures and crows and dogs and jackals and so forth. And some of them would have cloth on them. And so the monks were allowed to take that cloth after the body had been there a while, because there's this story in the text about this monk who took a burial shroud off of a freshly deposited body, and the freshly deposited body reanimated. So the monk was essentially chased by a zombie. So in order to avoid zombie chases in the future, the Buddha made this rule that the body has to like be cold and there for a while. I don't remember the exact length of time it has to be there before a monk is able to like take the cloth off of it in order to make robes out of it. But I mean, in that case, obviously, you got a burial shroud that was wrapping a corpse, then probably you should wash it before you wear it. I mean, you're going to have to wash the robe after you've been wearing it for a while. Washing robes is important. Also, if you're going to dye it with dye to turn it in the proper color, then generally you use like boiling hot dye, which is going to sterilize it anyway. And a lot of monks, like forest monks in Thailand, instead of washing their robes with like laundry detergent, they just re-dye it in this boiling hot solution of robe dye, which is like dissolved tree bark and resins and so forth. That not only fixes the dye, but it also sterilizes it and cleans it to some degree. And I knew a monk who tried to make a real Pamsuku robe out of rags. And it's not easy in Burma because Burma is not a rich country. Probably ancient India wasn't very rich either, but people don't throw away their old shirts and their sarongs and so forth until they are just no good anymore. You know, it's just really rags, just threadbare rags. And it's all different colors. Maybe not so much in ancient India, but nowadays you got all this like blue polyester and all this kind of stuff that when you make a robe out of it, this monk that I knew who made one of these, people really didn't like it because, I mean, he looked kind of like a clown because he's wearing this patchwork, all these different colors that the robe dye really can't cover over. You know, like using tree bark robe dye isn't going to cover over like a blue shirt that's part of your robe. It's going to stay pretty much blue. And so he got a lot of complaints and eventually stopped wearing that robe. He did get a shroud once that was just, it was just put there on, it was like folded up on top of this body for the lay people wanting merit by offering to this relatively advanced monk. So he just picked the shroud and just folded up cloth off of this corpse as a kind of, you know, ceremonial ritual way of getting a burial shroud that really wasn't a burial shroud. So the answer to that question in one word is yes, which I could have done, but I just got to ramble and stuff instead. So the second question from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, still known as Lieberlam in some circles, I'm pretty sure, is as follows. Do you find parapsychology or physicalist empiricism to be more explanatory to the nature of reality? Please provide exposition and note that I'm not asking which is optimized for experimental reproduction, but which best explains the real itself. Well, Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, seems not to really understand how parapsychology works, because there's all different sorts of interpretations of parapsychology. So, I mean, some parapsychology is physicalist empiricism. In fact, a lot of parapsychology is physicalist empiricism, especially like in the Soviet Union and in communist China. They had parapsychology labs where they're trying to understand, you know, parapsychology and like control it. You know, once you get spies that can read minds, then it's off to the races, you know. And then there was this woman in the Soviet Union. Her name was Nina Kulagina, if I remember correctly, and she could move objects. She was sort of like a Russian Yuri Geller who could like move objects without touching it and so forth. But what the Soviets and the Chinese didn't understand, or I mean, they were locked into Marxism, which is materialist. And so because their own ideology required them to consider parapsychology to be physical in nature, they've got like these special sensor helmets. They've got all these sensors everywhere trying to detect any kind of fields or rays or something coming out of the brain of the psychic that was doing this, and they failed. They had psychics or people who were talented with regard to certain psychic powers who could do amazing feats, kind of like Uri Geller was considered to have been able to do, but their approach to parapsychology was so materialistic that they just failed to understand it. So certain interpretations of parapsychology, like the interpretation given by what's his name, the trickster in the paranormal, I can't remember his name right offhand, but the author of The Trickster and the Paranormal, his interpretation of the nature of reality is much more explanatory of empirical reality than like scientific materialism. Scientific materialism is definitely deficient in certain ways. It cannot explain consciousness itself, for example. It's, like scientific materialists just cannot begin to explain how it is that this gray blob of meat that has the texture or consistency of an overripe avocado contained in your skull actually generates like subjective experience. They say, well, it's a byproduct of chemical reactions or whatever, but they don't know how. You know, it's just their best guess. So when you get into parapsychology that is more idealistic, philosophically idealist, saying that consciousness is more real than physical matter, then you've got a better chance at really getting into some profound understanding of our, you know, the human predicament, or what we are or how we are. So it depends on the interpretation of parapsychology, but a more idealist one that is not just materialistic is going to be more explanatory with regard to the nature of reality, because reality is not physical. So I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libra Lamb's third question, which is, do you feel that Christians use too much discursive reasoning when it comes to explaining God, and that we could characterize such a thing as God better as super mundane and thus incomprehensible by the ordinary mind? Well, Christianity is sort of like Buddhism in that respect, in that you've got all different kinds of Christians. Even within a single school of Christianity, you've got all different kinds of people. And some of them are going to be more mystically oriented, especially like in Catholicism or Greek Orthodox or whatever. You've got just radical mystics. Or there were certain schools, what was it, Docetism, where it was like you could not understand God by thinking about it. And so it was like quietism, where you would just, in a way, it was like a Buddhist kind of practice where you're just essentially doing deep meditation or contemplation, because that's the only way you could come anywhere close to really understanding God, is just through experiencing God directly by suppressing or dismissing all other kinds of perception until you've got like a mental flat calm going. So you're not distracted by all these waves, and so that you're more likely to be able to experience the Spirit of God, which pervades the entire universe, which is always right here all the time. So from a theistic point of view with a capital G, God, any kind of relatively sophisticated or advanced type of that is going to have the Spirit of God everywhere. It's not just that you got the angry old man with the beard sitting on a throne up in space. It's the Spirit of God is everywhere. And it's just saturating everything, including us, so that the best way to be aware of the presence of God is just dismiss all this distracting perceptual symbolic stuff from your mind, and then maybe, just maybe, you'll experience the presence of God, which is filling you all the time anyway. And that's found in Christianity and Hinduism and, you know, whatever, probably Sufism, which is a branch of Islam. Probably the Hebrews have got their own version of it, and definitely in Buddhism. Although just the intellectual, theoretical aspect of it will be different in Buddhism, because in Buddhism, technically there is no capital G God. So do I feel that Christians use too much discursive reasoning when it comes to explaining God? Yeah, but not all of them. It's just some Christians just aren't ready for advanced mysticism, just like most Buddhists aren't ready for advanced mysticism. And so they've got their Abhidhamma, they've got all their theories, they've got their rote explanations for what Nibbana is. And they just rely on that because they can't experience it in any other way. They can't experience it really in that way, but at least they got some kind of way of kind of dealing with it conceptually. So, yeah, I think it's that way in all religions, that the normies, most people, are just going to be dealing with mental concepts that really cannot approach the absolute. But that's really all they've got. That's the best they can do. And then you've got the more advanced people, a few like advanced mystic types, meditation masters and so forth, contemplatives, who are able to experience reality to some degree directly. Everybody has at least a little inkling of ultimate reality. That's sort of like our source, and we're just soaking in it. It's always there. I think it would take some kind of like non-sentient robot or maybe a vampire or something that is just completely cut off from the absolute. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Siovak and Sipad Zidana. And he says, you have said the world is an undifferentiated mass without perception. However, this seems to assume the world is continuous and on a spectrum, bleeding from one thing to another naturally. But if the world is quantized, then it seems there are natural divisions between one thing from another at the smallest scale. For example, you cannot say that an electron and photon are undifferentiated without perception because they are physically separated and have fundamentally different properties. They can't be broken down into any further parts. Hence, fundamental particles, even if you consider quantum mechanical waves, they are still quantized, meaning there is a natural differentiation and separation between things. Does my thought process have some validity to it, or do you think there is something I am missing here? Well, that's the main question. There's kind of a double question here. Does my thought process have some validity to it? No. And then, do you think there is something I'm missing here? Yes. See, what you're trying to do, you're trying to dismiss perception out the front door and then just sneak it back in through the back. So let's see, up here towards the top. This seems to assume the world is continuous and on a spectrum. No, if there is no differentiation, there is no spectrum. There is no difference. Bleeding from one thing to another, there is no one thing to another. I mean, just forget that. That is just void, invalid. So, but if the world is quantized, then it seems there are natural divisions between one thing and another at the smallest scale. Yeah, so long as you've got perception dividing stuff up and like giving identities to different things. It may be that there was some misunderstanding with regard to how, I mean, in the previous Q&A, I was talking about how you divide things up is arbitrary. So you can identify an entire forest. You could single out a clump of trees in that forest. You could single out a single tree. You could single out a branch on that tree. You can single out a twig on that branch. You can single out a leaf on that twig. You can single out like a cell in that leaf. You could single out like an organelle within that cell, a molecule within the organelle, an atom within the molecule, a subatomic particle within the atom. But that doesn't mean, I mean, it could be misunderstood that I think that all of that is real. But I was just talking about the arbitrary nature of identifying anything. That where you draw the line, but still you've already got perception that's dividing stuff up. And if you get rid of perception, this symbolic interpretation, it is as though there is nothing left. There were Buddhist philosophers in medieval India, if not ancient India, that were really discussing this a lot. I think it was called the Dignaga school. Venerable Dharmodara was a famous member of this school who made the statement, and I'm not going to try and find it, but if you get rid of all perceptual interpretation, then, I mean, all you got left is just emptiness. It is as though there's no sensory data at all. And in order to have any kind of differentiation, you have to have relations, which are like same as, different from would be two of the main ones: bigger than, smaller than, better than, worse than. But just like same as or different from, you've got to have that in order to divide the universe up into parts. And same as and different from do not exist out there. They are psychological processes. They're psychological interpretations. They are perceptual. You get rid of the perception, that's it. It's all gone. So I think I ranted myself into a dead end there. So anyways, it's all just mind-made. You get rid of the mind-made aspect of it, and it's just blank, void. Or it's nirvana, it's ultimate reality. But it's still not really divided up into parts except through perception, which is delusional. So I'm just going to move on to CO of Action Sipad Zidano's next question. And I don't know why Ted Kaczynski he's two people asked about him in this Q&A. So anyways, CO of Action Sipad Zidano says, have you read Industrial Society and Its Future by Dr. Theodore John Kaczynski? He was a famous child genius who was a Harvard-trained math professor by 25 and made many strides in the fields of physics, like in string theory, due to other people using his mathematical discoveries. He also happens to be called the Unabomber by some people. If you have read the manifesto, what are your thoughts on it from a Dhamma perspective? I haven't read the manifesto. I think my brother read it, who is totally black-pilled on politics and just the world in general. So he mentioned it to me a few times. And I did watch like a documentary about John Kaczynski, or Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, that was talking about how there was some kind of clandestine mental experimentation done on him, like MK Ultra kind of stuff when he was younger. And that may have been what kind of fucked his mind up and caused him to start trying to murder people. But I mean, he could be another case of somebody like Nikola Tesla, who was like a scientific genius, but also kind of nutty at the same time. I mean, obviously, if you're trying to kill people by sending bombs in the mail, then, I mean, that's not exactly well balanced psychologically. So, yeah, I haven't really read what he wrote. I mean, he seems to be, I mean, you can argue just about any kind of point in a persuasive, cogent kind of way. But I mean, that's one of the problems with this world, is there's not just one correct way of interpreting things. And you can take a kind of black-pilled, very cynical kind of interpretation of things. But at the same time, you can take another kind of interpretation that isn't as black-pilled or as cynical, and it's just as valid or just as invalid, depending on how you want to look at it. But yeah, I mean, the main question here is easy to answer because I really have not read the Unabomber's manifesto. I have read a few manifestos in my life, but that isn't one of them. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here, also from CO of Action Sipad Zirna. In Udana 5.1, Queen Malika told her husband that she finds herself most dear, and the king Pasenadi agreed and felt the same way. They went to the Buddha, who agreed with them and said, quote, searching all directions with your awareness, you find no one dearer than yourself, unquote. Since you have a wife now, do you agree with the Buddha? So, yeah, before I answer the question, I would just point out that King Pasenadi was the king of Kosala, which was one of the two main regional powers in the Ganges Valley in the Buddhist time. And it eventually got conquered by Magadha, which grew into an empire after the Buddha died. And Malika was his favorite wife, even though she had a dark complexion and was considered not to be beautiful. But anyways, In the Udana 5.1, 5-1, chapter 5, Sutta 1, Pasenadi asks Malika, his wife, his favorite wife, who is most dear to her, possibly expecting her to say that he was. And she honestly and wisely said, no, that she considers herself more dear than anyone else. And then King Pasenadi had to agree, yeah, I guess you're right. That's the way it is with everybody. But I mean, there are qualifications to that. With regard to like doing what I consider to be right, something like that. I mean, I'm not just going to completely simp for my woman and just do whatever she wants me to do. I do have certain principles and standards, and I'm going to live my own life to a certain degree, as well as I can. But on the other hand, if I had to choose, if one of us had to die, I'd choose myself without hesitation. I'd let myself die. I would let her live and me die. So, I mean, it depends on how you look at it, I suppose. With regard to standing up for my principles and so forth, I would prefer standing up to my own principles than standing up to my wife's principles. In many cases, anyway. You have to compromise to some degree if you're in a relationship. But again, I mean, if one of us had to die, then I would volunteer for that. So, I mean, I love her more than my own life in that regard anyway. I love her life more than I love my life, to the extent of I'd be willing to die for her sake, even though I won't agree to do whatever she tells me to do. So I'm just moving on to the next question here. This is from Xenothoid. Xenothoid says, have you read the entire Pali canon? No, I haven't read the entire Pali canon. I've read the entire Vinaya Pitaka, the first 4 books in Pali, and then the last in English translation. I've read the entire Digha Nikaya in English and Pali, the entire Majjhima Nikaya in English and Pali, most of the Samyutta, or maybe at least half of the Samyutta in Pali, and I don't think I've even read the entire Samyutta in English translation. The Anguttara Nikaya, which of the main 4 Nikayas was least interesting to me, and I've just kind of read bits and pieces in Pali or in English. I haven't read the entire thing of that. And then with regard to the Abhidhamma, there's also the Khuddaka Nikaya. I've read the main texts of the Khuddaka Nikaya. Like, I've read the Sutta Nipata, the Dhammapada, the Udana. I can't remember if I've read the entire Idivuddaka. I don't think I've read the entire Therigatha or Therigatha, although I have read, many of the verses in there. And with regard to a lot of the fairy tale stuff, like the Jatakas, I've read some of the Jatakas in Pali and in English. I've read, small parts of like the Buddha Wamsa, that kind of thing. But a lot of it, or also the Peta Watu. I read the entire Peta Watu in the Polytext Society English translation. But yeah, I haven't read even all of the suttas, especially when you get into the Khuddaka Nikaya. There's a lot of that I haven't read. And with regard to Abhidhamma, the only Abhidhamma book that I've read in its entirety is the Kata Watu that I mentioned earlier, the grounds of controversy, the grounds of discussion, which was a manual helping Theravada monks debate against Buddhist monks of other schools. I've read like the Abhidhammata Sangaha, which is that compilation, the summary of Abhidhamma philosophy. I've read a lot of Abhidhamma stuff just because in Burma, you just wind up with these books. The Essence of Buddha Abhidhamma by Dr. Min Tin Mun. I mean, you couldn't get rid of it. You get rid of it, and a week later, somebody would offer you another copy of it. So, yeah, I haven't read the entire thing. And there's a few texts that haven't even been translated in English, like the Nidesa is part of the Khuddaka Nikaya. I've read probably most of the Mahanidesa. I've read pretty much none of the Chula Nidesa. It's divided up into 2 parts. So, yeah, there's not a whole lot of people who have really read the entire Pali canon, some of which you'd have to read not in English, but in some other language because not all of it is translated into English. And even I used to know this monk, a Western monk, who was really into Abhidhamma. He was really interested in Abhidhamma. And with regard to the Patana, which is the last book of Abhidhamma, which is several thick volumes, he said it's unreadable. That it's just so technical and complicated and just abstract and dry and dull that you just can't read it. It's just unreadable. So I guess I answered that one. I'm moving on to Xenothoid's next question, which is, do you know if anyone has attempted to make a shorter version of the canon that removes all the repetition that is no longer needed because of writing? I do enjoy the meditative aspect of reading a repetitive text with slight variations, but at a certain point it can get tiresome. I think this aspect of the text might turn off a lot of potential readers from gaining the wisdom they're looking for. Well, I guess the main question here is, has anyone attempted to make a shorter version of the canon that removes all the repetition? And even the official Tipitakas, like the Burmese government's version of the Tipitaka, has a lot of ellipsis. In fact, there's a Pali word for it called pala. So, it'll just have like a pa. It'll be like ... and then in parentheses pa, and then ... and then continue with the Pali text, because there's so much repetition that some texts, it's mostly pala. Like in the Samyutta Nikaya, you get to these chapters, these samyuttas, where you might have 10 suttas that are exactly the same with just like one word different in each one. And so when you read, even in the official Burmese government edition of the Pali Tipitaka, it's the whole sutta will just be, it'll all be pala with just this one word. It might have just a thus have I heard at the beginning, and then it'll be, it'll just give a few lines just to kind of let you know that it's the same as the one before it, and then it's all ellipsis and pala, and that's it. So there are, even in these official versions from Theravada Buddhist countries, that some suttas are mostly omitted just because it's exactly the same. It's several suttas in a row that are exactly the same with just like one phrase or word different. And English translations, like Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations, as a general rule, they get rid of most of the repetition. At least half of the repetition they get rid of. It's just tedious. If you're memorizing it by heart, which is what it was designed for, you kind of like the repetitions because it's easier to memorize and easier to just keep it memorized. But when you're reading it in a book, it gets tedious, even for like Burmese monks who are very dogmatic and just don't mind repetition very much. But still, it's the whole way that the whole texts are composed. It's just not the way people talk. Like the Buddha, it's like, I saw 3 cows in a field yesterday. What were those 3 cows? I saw a brown cow in the field yesterday. That is the first cow that I saw. I saw a black cow in the field yesterday. That is the second cow that I saw. I saw a spotted cow in the field yesterday. That is the third cow that I saw. Those are the 3 cows that I saw in the field yesterday. When all you have to do is just say, I saw a brown, a black, and a spotted cow in the field yesterday. And that's the entire amount of information is there in that one sentence, instead of being spread out into like 3 paragraphs. So, most versions of the Tipitaka do reduce the amount of repetition, and like Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations, it's reduced quite a lot. But I don't know if anyone has really attempted to make a shorter version of the entire Tipitaka where it's just all repetition is removed. I don't know. You'd have to have a lot of ellipsis, or else you'd have to like monkey with the grammar or something to get rid of it. And I don't think anyone has bothered. So I'm just going to move on to the Xenothoid's third question here, which is, you've mentioned that some of the texts most likely come straight from Siddhartha Gautama Buddha. Some do not come from him, although he would still approve them, and some he would denounce. Would you ever consider ranking each section of the canon, or perhaps even each individual sutta, by how genuine they are? I know a lot of people cringe at tier list videos, but I think this could make for an interesting one. Well, there's one major problem with that, is that you can't really be sure. There's no way of being certain. There could be a text. I mean, the exact quotes, I mean, how are you going to know if the Buddha said it in exactly those words? Also, there could be a text that's just a kind of conservative text that was composed centuries after the time of the Buddha, but it's all like really orthodox stuff that is indistinguishable from the earlier stuff. So you really can't know for sure. And I think the best attempt at this that I have seen is in Studies in the Origins of Buddhism by G.C. Pandey, who goes through each of the main the Sutta collections, the Nikayas, and goes sutta by sutta through the first two, and then I don't know, I'm just kind of confusing myself now. But G.C. Pandey does the best attempt at that. And if it was going to be a video, I mean, it would be an extremely long video, because there's like 40 volumes in the Tipitaka. Although some things like Abhidhamma you can just dismiss right off the bat, like I've already mentioned. And in G.C. Pandey's book, Studies in the Origins of Buddhism, he does dismiss Abhidhamma like on page 1. You know, he just gives the lateness of the Abhidhamma Pitaka is manifest. You know, he gives a few just of the main reasons for that, and then just ignores it for the rest of the book. He doesn't talk much about Vinaya, but like the Patimokkha's, especially the Patimokkha's, not including the Sakya rules, that would be like the oldest stratum of the Vinaya. Let's see. So, let's see, where's the question mark? Would you ever consider ranking each section of the canon, or perhaps even each individual sutta, by how genuine they are? Yeah, I mean, it would require a lot of guessing. It'd be educated guessing, but still you can't really be sure how old the text is. I mean, you can weed out some of the obviously bogus ones, like the ones with like glaring anachronisms, or Abhidhamma, for example, as later additions to the text. You can do like what A.K. Warder did and just identify the core texts, which are the texts that are common to all or almost all of the ancient Indian schools of Buddhism that arose before Mahayana. That gets you down to before the first schism anyway, with a reasonable amount of confidence. So for A.K. Warder, that was good enough. He just got down to the core text and considered that to be authentic teachings of the Buddha. But I mean, all that does is get you within 100 years of the Buddha's life. And a lot of change can happen in 100 years. A lot of change happened in Christianity in the first 100 years. A lot of bogus texts got added to Christianity in the first 100 years, including some that are in the Bible today. So yeah, it would have to involve a lot of guessing, and it would be an extremely long video, possibly even longer than the Q&A videos are. So if you really want to study up on something like that, I would recommend Studies in the Origins of Buddhism by G.C. Pandey, who really did attempt to identify as well as he could. He had to guess or just sort of say, this one's uncertain with regard to, you know, the main texts anyway. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo said, did you read comic books and or graphic novels, either growing up or later as an adult? If so, which titles or characters were your favorites and why? How about Mad Magazine? Were you a fan of it? So with regard to comic books, there's only two kinds of comic books that I read when I was a kid. One was when I'd get my hair cut at Ernie and Ray's barbershop in Aberdeen, Washington. They had like Richie Rich, and Casper the Friendly Ghost and stuff that I would read when I was waiting to get my hair cut. But I wouldn't waste my money on buying one of these for myself. There's other things that I would rather have than those kind of comic books. And then also, for a few years anyway, I had as a stepbrother Kurt Vanderhoof, who, I mean, he started making it kind of big in rock and roll. He was in the band Metal Church, and then as soon as it started getting really big, he kind of dropped out of rock and roll musicianship and became like a producer or something. But he had all kinds of comic books when he was a kid, and some of the comic books he didn't like much anymore. He offloaded onto me, and it was mostly Spider-Man. So he had all these Spider-Man comics. I just wound up with this pile of Spider-Man comics, you know, fighting the Green Goblin and Doc Ock and this kind of thing. And so I pretty much worked my way through that. But again, I just read them because they were given to me, and I never spent a dime on any comic book as far as I can remember. There was a kind of graphic novel that I read when I was in my 20s. It was Brothers of the Head by Brian Aldiss, about this rock musician who was, actually it was two rock musicians. They were Siamese twins, and they had a third dormant head on the shoulder of one of them. And the dormant head starts waking up during the course of the novel. And it was a graphic novel. It was illustrated. So, I mean, that would be the only graphic novel I ever read. But with regard to Mad Magazine, I was heavily into Mad Magazine as a kid. I would spend a lot of money on Mad Magazine, a lot of money from a kid's point of view who just has like, you know, $5 a week allowance or something. But yeah, I had Mad Magazine. I was into like, what was his name? Don Martin. He was good. Spy versus Spy. I liked Al Jaffe, Snappy Answers to Stupid Questions. I think I had all of his Snappy Answers to Stupid Questions series. It's good for a young smartass to get guidance on how to give smartass answers to stupid questions. So yeah, Mad Magazine would be the main one. But I haven't read Mad Magazine in a long time. I'm not even sure if they even have it anymore. And I pretty much started losing interest in that when I got into like high school and just started reading science fiction instead. So Mad Magazine was pre-science fiction in the evolution of my reading tastes. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Al. And Al says, what do you think of the recent drama that has unfolded in the TWIM community with Delson Armstrong renouncing all of his attainments? Do you think TWIM is a legitimate Theravada group? So I guess that's two questions. There's two question marks here. So let's see. What did I just do? Okay. So what do I think of the recent drama that has unfolded in the TWIM community with Delson Armstrong renouncing all of his attainments? Well, Delson Armstrong was another one of these people who just declared and announced and advertised that he was an arahant, that he was fully enlightened. And I just found out about Delson Armstrong recently. It was just after this kind of scandal happened. And apparently what happened was he was declaring himself to be an arahant, fully enlightened being. And then I think he fell in love with a young woman or something, which then was sufficient evidence that he still had like cravings and attachments and so forth. And so maybe due to an outcry from his supporters, he had to humbly admit, well, yeah, maybe I'm not really fully enlightened, which is another case of like I was talking about earlier with regard to, what's his name? And TWIM, I'm really not sure what TWIM is. Tranquility, something insight meditation, with a lot of emphasis on metta meditation, which is something that is just too touchy-feely for my interests. Any kind of community, insight meditation community that really emphasizes metta meditation, I don't know, I just don't feel it. So, I mean, this whole case reminds me of Andrew Cohen back in the 90s, who was another one of these people who just declares himself fully enlightened. And then over the years, he keeps behaving in an unenlightened way until he gets enough pushback from his followers that he just comes out and announces, well, maybe I wasn't really enlightened to begin with. So again, whether Delson Armstrong was just deliberately deceiving people or whether he just overestimated his own attainments, I really don't know, because I don't know anything about Delson Armstrong. So I'm just going to move on to Al's next question, which was part of the first question, which is, do you think TWIM is a legitimate Theravada group? Well, you got some layperson advertised as fully enlightened, and there's a monk who is one of the leaders who's just going along with that. Then yeah, I think that it wouldn't be fully legitimate. I don't think it's like fully illegitimate. That probably some of what they're teaching is in accordance with Theravada or Buddhism in general, but not everything. And so I would give that a partially legitimate and partially illegitimate status. Maybe it's a little more legitimate now that the professed Arahant has outed himself as not really an Arahant. So, but yeah, I mean, I never followed TWIM. I don't know much about it. I saw a picture of the old monk who's one of the leaders, and he looked familiar, but that's about as far as it goes. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Virgin Mary J, also known as Cherzaskaziz. And Virgin Mary J says, Mary J, I mean, he shouldn't really be a virgin. I think this is also one of those false declarations, because he does have a woman. So anyways, Virgin Mary J says, have you ever read Industrial Society and Its Future by Ted Kaczynski? If yes, what do you think about it? Well, no, I haven't read it. Like I said before, I have read a few manifestos, radical manifestos in my life, but that was not one of them. And yeah, I mean, I've seen quotes from it, like excerpts from it, that are kind of like a kind of black-pilled, cynical interpretation of things that have their own validity, their own truth and all. But, I mean, you don't necessarily have to interpret it the same way as him. All interpretations are ultimately invalid anyhow. But, I mean, he was a brilliant thinker, and at the same time, he was also kind of nutty and was like sending bombs to people in the mail trying to kill them. So I'll just move on to Virgin Mary J's second question. Anything on live stream on December 1st? Yeah, I think I can go for that. Let's just plan on me doing a live stream Sunday morning or early Sunday afternoon, no later than mid Sunday afternoon next Sunday, which would be December 1st, 2024. And hopefully I will be better at figuring out how to do a live stream. The first live stream that I did, the previous live stream that I did, was the only live stream I've ever done. And those of you who were there may notice that I was actually accidentally turning off the live stream and then having to like kind of start a whole new live stream again, because you can't just end it and then get back on again. You have to like start from scratch. And it was very frustrating because I didn't know that whether or not I was recording. So it looked like I wasn't recording. And so then I'm like turning it off and cussing, and maybe cussing before I turned it off, and just trying to figure out how to do this. So yeah, let's just say I'll do a live stream on December 1st, inshallah, assuming that I can do it at least as well as I did it the first time. So I'm just going to move on to Virgin Mary J's third question. If the middle way in ancient India wouldn't be the middle way today, but rather extreme asceticism, what would be nowadays the middle way between rat race, consumptionist Instagram life, and living alone in the woods? Well, that's a good question, and it's something I used to think about a lot when I was a monk, because when you're talking about the history and evolution of Buddhism, you started off with the middle way between self-indulgence and self-torture. And almost immediately, especially after Buddhism became a popular spiritual system, like a popular religion, then you wind up with a new middle way, which is the middle way between self-indulgence and the original middle way. And then when Buddhism came to the West, then you wind up with an even newer middle way, which is the middle way between self-indulgence and the traditional middle way between self-indulgence and the original middle way. So the middle way just keeps moving farther and farther towards wallowing in self-indulgence, and it's already got a fair amount of wallowing in it already when you look at Buddhism in the West, where pretty much all you have to do is just meditate sometimes, and that's pretty much all you have to do, at least in a lot of Buddhist meditation groups or Buddhist groups, Dharma halls, that kind of thing. So, I mean, I don't think it's a good idea to start monkeying with a spiritual system in order to make it conform more to social and moral degeneracy. So I'm quite content with letting the middle way be the original middle way and just acknowledging that that is seen as extreme nowadays by decadent, degenerate modern people. But still, I'm quite content to go along with the ancient Indian middle way as declared by the historical Buddha himself, that so long as you're not torturing yourself and you're not wallowing in sensuality, you're not like avoiding discomfort and you're not seeking discomfort really, then that's the middle way. And I mean, you can be a little liberal in your interpretation of that. I mean, you might want to prefer that you don't necessarily have to be wandering beggar with no money and no family and no home. Because it is pretty remarkable when you think that the original middle way, the moderate centrist way, was wandering around homeless, dressed in rags with zero money, zero family, zero home, just begging for your food in the streets. So it's the middle way from a dharmic point of view. It's certainly not the middle way from a social point of view. So yeah, I'm just inclined to just stick with the original middle way and everyone just be honest and say, well, I'm just not following that. It's just too much for me or whatever. So I guess I answered that one, kind of. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And by golly, we are still recording, aren't we? And Rui says, hello, Panyo, a non-Dhammic question. Have you or anyone else noticed the following panel just below the video? And he's referring to the previous Q&A video. United Nations climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperatures. Oh, it's just United Nations dot. Climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. Human activities have been the main driver of climate change, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, unquote. So, let's see here. Rui continues here. It is impossible to get rid of the thing. It just sits there, plus click on it, and you'll be directed to a page of UN Cultural Revolution style propaganda. It somehow feels like it's meant to re-educate those who might have searched for online material deemed as climate denialism, including funny enough science sites and or videos, as well as general non-woke stuff. So I guess the main question here is, have you or anyone else noticed the following panel just below the video? Yeah, I definitely noticed that. It appeared immediately upon uploading that video. That it's just like the AI, or whatever you want to call it, just flagged that climate change in the title and just slapped that label, that explanation underneath. And it happens a lot. Like when I did the Trump landslide video with our good friend Brian, immediately it had like the election results, in a similar little banner, little box underneath the video. It happens automatically, and there's no way you can get rid of it other than just get rid of YouTube. And I mean, what it says here, the United Nations, I mean, that's already suspect. The United Nations is not an objective body. It's not people like sincerely trying to find the truth. It's just, they've got an agenda. It's a globalist agenda, and they're just going to say and do what furthers the globalist agenda. So climate change refers to long-term shift in temperatures and weather patterns. Human activities have been the main driver of climate change, which is itself controversial. There are scientists saying, nope, that's not true. Some scientists will say it's like fluctuations in the radiation coming from the sun that's causing it. And even if it is true that human activities have been the main driver of climate change, and I mean, I'm not going to deny that we have been, increasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But like I was saying in the previous Q&A, for most of the existence of the Earth, it has been much warmer with much more carbon dioxide than now. And that really the only realistic thing that we can do is just prepare for a warmer Earth with maybe somewhat higher sea levels, although of course Manhattan still isn't underwater like Al Gore was claiming it was going to be many years ago. So it's not nearly as much of a threat as the globalist establishment would have us believe, because there's still nukes in this world. There's still the threat of the technological singularity with AI taking over, which both of those are certainly more of a threat than the Earth gradually warming up. So the question is, have we noticed it? Yeah, it's like the very first comment I think on that was mentioning this United Nations like semi-propagandist disclaimer underneath the video. So I'm just going to move on to Rui's next question is, what did your penance consist of? And I assume he's referring to the penance for Sanghadisesa offenses. And the abbot of the monastery that I first lived at in Burma, who was one of my teachers, he took this penance once a year just to sort of get rid of any kind of doubts, because some of these rules, you can be in doubt. Like the very first Sanghadisesa is to have an orgasm deliberately. And sometimes it's like you can wake up in the middle of a wet dream. This happened to me a couple times. And it's like you start like moving just sort of instinctively. And then you got to like psychoanalyze yourself. It's like, was I helping to cause that to happen kind of stuff? Or one that happens even more often for Burmese monks that seem to be lower T and less lustful than Western monks is they're like on a bus or something and they brush up against a young woman. And it's like, that's Sanghadisesa number 2, is to touch a woman with your mind inflamed by lust. And it's interpreted in such a way that even if you just enjoy the contact, then that's good enough. So long as you make any kind of move, even just the width of a sesame seed, just a hair's breadth towards her to prolong or continue the contact, then you're guilty of breaking that rule. And monks get on buses, including some strict monks, will get on a bus or something, and some pretty girl will brush up against them, and it's like, what do I do? So they'll do. I mean, some sloppy monks will be like deliberately brushing up against the women because they're completely shameless monks. There's more of those in Burma than the really conscientious ones, I'm sorry to say. It's like that in Theravada Buddhist countries in general, I'm pretty sure. But you do you commit a Sanghadisesa offense and you confess it, and then you have to do penance for 6 days and 6 nights, plus however many days you failed to confess the offense. So if you break a rule, a Sanghadisesa rule, let's say you spanked the puppy or whatever it was, and you wait a week to make confession, even though there are opportunities to make confession, you've got to do the penance for another week, an extra week in addition to the 6 days and 6 nights. And how it's done in reality is very different from how you're required to do it in the Vinaya itself. So the Burmese monks just turned into a kind of game. It's really awful the way the Burmese monks do this, and I've never approved of it. I got in so much trouble over this. Even my own abbot would be doing penance for Sanghadisesa, because a lot of monks do it, and they would do it in this completely bogus, sloppy way that was traditional in Burma, but just flatly against what the texts say. And I would just refuse to go to their ceremonies. They were gonna, one of the penances you have to do is every day you have to make confession to every monk at the monastery that you have committed the Sanghadisesa offense. And when it's the abbot, just all the monks get called into the Dharma hall or called to the abbot's quarters so that he can make confession. And I'm just like, no, you're not the abbot so long as you're doing this penance. You are the lowest monk at the monastery. Because that's the penance. That's how it works, is when you're doing this penance, you are the lowest monk at the monastery. You're not allowed to sleep under the same roof with other monks. You have to go last in line. You have to, you have to sit at the back if the monks are gathered together. You got to make these confessions. You're not allowed to have anyone bow to you, at least not other monks, because you're the lowest one. You got to stand up if another monk comes into the room, because you shouldn't be sitting when another monk is standing, because that's disrespectful. There's more than 90 penances that have to be done. A lot of them are, it's kind of obscure and the situation doesn't arise. But essentially you have to be kind of an outcast monk. You're not allowed to sleep in the main general area where the other monks sleep. You got to get like the worst cabin on the outskirts of the monastery. And just, you are like the lowest peon monk at the monastery until your penance is complete. And you do that for 6 days and 6 nights, plus however much extra you have to do because of not confessing the offense right away. And the way it's done in Burma is you take the penance upon yourself at dusk, and then at night, when you don't have to walk in the back of the line or anything like that, you do the penance, and then at dawn the next day, you stop taking the penance, and you're right back to being a regular monk again during the daytime. It's only nighttime penance, which is not the way it's supposed to be done. It's just like bullshit, cheating the rules. It's traditional in Burma. Even the serious monks will do it that way, but I just refused. It was just too much. It was hardly even penance at all. So yeah, I defied two abbots, at least two abbots, with regard to just refusing to go to their ceremonies and that kind of thing, just because they hadn't really done the penance. The reinstatement ceremony at the end, you have to have at least 20 monks to convene to reinstate a monk who is doing penance, and I would just refuse to go. It's like, fuck that. They didn't do penance as far as I'm concerned. But if you really want to know all the list, it's like between 90 and 100 penances of these observances. Wata, it's called. Like Sila Bhatta Paramasa, which is clinging to morality and observances. Wata is observances. And so these penances are observances that have to be observed while you're doing penance. And I already named, the most important ones. You have to make confession to every monk at the monastery every day, which is really a pain in the ass, especially if there's lots of monks coming and going. It's really, you have to do penance for a few extra days just to make sure that you got it, because there's like, you go to make your confession and it's like, where is Venerable so-and-so? It's like, oh, he left this morning. It's like, well, that day doesn't count because I had to make confession to him. And he was there that day and he left before I could make confession to him. So that whole day doesn't count. And then just, going at the back of the line and sleeping in the worst place on the outskirts of the monastery, that kind of thing. Now, that was mainly what it was about. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Raphael. And Raphael, this is an easy question. He says, how good is Piya Tan's translation of the suttas? I have no idea who Piya Tan is. So, Tan is like it just means like a monk in Thai. So his name would be Piya. But I don't know who this monk Piya is. So I have no idea how good his translations are. Sorry, Raphael. I don't know. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Eckhart Bala. And I'm not exactly sure why a certain person has decided to start calling himself Eckhart Bala. But that's what he's calling himself. And so he says, how do you say nice in Pali? For instance, have a nice day, or be nice, children. And I mean, nice would essentially be good. Have a good day, or be good, children. So nice and good, I'm assuming, are pretty much synonyms in Pali. And good, I mean, kalyana, like the kalyana mita, is like the main translation you'll find. Like probably in an English to Pali dictionary, you look up good or nice in an English to Pali dictionary, it'll probably say kalyana, like the kalyana mita, or the good friend. But really, kalyana means something more like beautiful. Like a kalyani is a beautiful woman, not because she's virtuous. In fact, the kalyani was generally like the most beautiful prostitute in the area. So it doesn't necessarily mean virtuous. But so I don't think that really kalyana would be the best translation of good or nice. It would be something like sukhita or sukhita. Like su, the prefix su at the beginning of a word generally means good, or like well done, or something like that. So probably the most common word for good would be like sukhita, which literally means like well done, or sukhita, something like that. But yeah, I'm kind of rusty on my Pali, so I can't say for 100% sure. But like the prefix su itself is like it just means good. So like with regard to good conduct, sukhada would be like having good conduct, or it would just mean good conduct, a good deed, well done, that kind of thing. But there could be like a common word for good that I'm just missing out on. I mean, obviously, right would be sama, like sama sambuddha or samaditi. Like the Noble Eightfold Path is a bunch of samas, but I guess that's different. So I'm just going to move on to Sampapalapa. And his question is, what's the difference between bodhisattva in Mahayana and Theravada traditions? I'm thinking Theravada is just anyone on the path to awakening, and Mahayanans believe in bodhisattvas being almost godlike beings that play a role in our lives or come back from pure land to become Buddhas or whatever. It's all very confusing. Please enlighten me. Well, yeah, Sampapalapa's theory is not entirely correct here. Originally, bodhisatta in Pali, it meant someone who is destined to become a Buddha, or probably more correctly, it was destined to become the Buddha. So that in the Pali texts, when it's referring to the Buddha before his enlightenment, sometimes it refers to him as the bodhisatta. And bodhisattva probably is a wrong translation of bodhisatta. Bodhisattva means enlightenment being, whereas bodhisatta, it could mean enlightenment being. Satta and sattva they correlate between Pali and Sanskrit, but probably satta in Pali was like a past participle turned into a noun of the verb sajjati, which means like to be bound for, to be bound to be attached to be destined for. So probably bodhisatta meant one who was destined for enlightenment, not an enlightenment being, which doesn't make much sense because a bodhisatta in many cases is someone who has indefinitely postponed enlightenment. So why do you call someone who has postponed enlightenment an enlightenment being? That in itself is kind of suggestive that the Mahayana Buddhists mistranslated the word and didn't really even understand what it originally was supposed to mean, which does happen, that some of the translations from Pali or Proto-Pali into Sanskrit are just false translations. They're not accurate translations. And I think this is one of those cases. So anyways, in Theravada, a bodhisatta is someone who is destined to become a fully enlightened Buddha. Not just an enlightened being, not just an ordinary arahant, but a Sama Sambuddha, someone who after Buddhism has died out, after Dharma has died out in the world, he rediscovers it and starts the wheel of Dharma rolling again. He starts it turning. So that's what a Buddha is in Theravada. It's someone who rediscovers Dhamma after it has died out. So in order to be a bodhisatta, like to be a real, genuine bodhisatta in Theravada, you have to meet a few qualifications. I think you have to master the 4 jhanas first before you can become a real bodhisatta. And also, you have to be declared a bodhisatta by a fully enlightened Buddha. Like, for example, our historical Gautama Buddha, according to tradition, he was declared a bodhisatta by the Buddha Dipankara, who lived like zillions of years ago on some previous earth. He was like 28 Buddhas into the past before we got to Gautama. And then Gautama was a kind of ascetic named Sumedha, like Ajahn Sumedho. You know, he was this kind of I think he was a Brahmin named Sumedha. And according to the story, he had volunteered to help make this footpath for Dipankara Buddha and his retinue who were going to come to this Dharma hall to get offered a meal. And he just couldn't keep up with what he was like required to do. And so there was like this unfinished stretch of about 6 feet of path that wasn't done yet before Dipankara and his retinue were going to come. You know, they were going to walk over the path. So he just lay down and just let his body be their footpath. And then after this event, Dipankara Buddha said that, you know, in a future life, you will be, you know, a Buddha named Gautama, etc., etc. So it's somewhat more technical than in Mahayana. In Mahayana, it's someone who has decided that to be a fully enlightened Buddha is better than to become an ordinary enlightened being or arahant, which they have demoted down to someone who's not even fully enlightened, really, at least in some schools. So I think both of them, bodhisatta in Pali and the, in my opinion, mistranslated bodhisattva in Mahayana Buddhism, they're both someone who is destined to become a fully enlightened Buddha in the future, probably the very distant future. But there are just different qualifications to it in Theravada and Mahayana. And I mean, both of them can be a godlike being. Like, for example, our Buddha, our Gautama Buddha, before he was a human being in this life, he was a deity in Tawatimsa heaven. So, I mean, according to tradition, of course. So, I mean, then you had the bodhisatta was a small g god in a heaven realm. So you can have bodhisatta gods in Theravada. It's just that there's lots fewer of them. You don't have entire retinues of bodhisattvas in Theravada Buddhism. That was a later development. And some texts, some Mahayana texts even have like retinues of Pacceka Buddhas attending on the Buddha, which, I mean, from the older Theravada point of view is just impossible, because Pacceka Buddhas were hermit Buddhas who exist only when there is no Buddhism in this world. That's why they're hermits, is they're not teaching Buddhism. I mean, they've kind of rediscovered Dhamma for themselves, but they don't teach it. They're just a hermit living out in a cave somewhere. So I think the basic meaning of bodhisatta and bodhisattva are the same. It's someone who is destined to become a Buddha in the future, but isn't a Buddha yet. But then the whole approach to it, like emphasizing the importance, the superiority of that path in Mahayana is absent in Theravada, although it was like the beginnings of it, the roots of it are found in these older traditions like in Theravada, and even that is an anachronism. I don't think that the whole bodhisattva or bodhisatta idea originated with the Buddha himself, because I think the Buddha was an arahant, and he was like the first one. He was the one who started the tradition going. But I mean, there was no original idea that to be a Buddha is something that you should go for instead of just becoming enlightened in this very life. In Theravada, the Buddha made no secret of the fact that he considered it better become fully enlightened in this very life if you possibly can. And that a fully enlightened Buddha and an ordinary arahant, both of them are fully enlightened. They have zero delusion. You can't get any wiser than zero delusion. So the Buddha was just the first one. He wasn't like infinitely beyond an ordinary fully enlightened being like later tradition turned him into, because it's just standard in human religious thought that you glorify the founder of your religion. Obviously in Christianity, he got turned into God Almighty. With regard to Buddhism, I mean, they still admit that he was a human, but he was just so far beyond other humans that, I mean, he's just totally glorified. He's higher than the gods. The gods come down from heaven and worship him. So I was going to say something else too. I'll just sip at my cold coffee. Yeah, I can't use the thermos mug kind of thing because the paper umbrella doesn't fit into it very well. So, oh yeah, I was going to say that probably the whole bodhisattva idea comes from the glorification of the Buddha. And then you had like Jataka stories that are talking about the Buddha's evolution in wisdom and other qualities, other virtues, the paramis, over millions and millions of years. And it just started coming into vogue to consider to be a Buddha is just so much more heroic, so much more difficult, so much more worthy than just being an ordinary enlightened being, that later schools like Mahayana schools just started just kind of rejecting the whole idea of becoming enlightened in this very life, which is what the Buddha was teaching. So they reject what the Buddha was teaching in favor of we should become like the Buddha himself and just postpone enlightenment, possibly indefinitely, which was pretty much the opposite of what the Buddha was teaching. But we don't have to go there. But the basic definition of a bodhisatta or a bodhisattva is pretty much the same, that it's just someone who is destined in the future to become a Buddha. Although the qualifications for that are much higher in Theravada. Like I said, you have to master the 4 jhanas, and you have to receive what in Burmese is called the Bia, which is an actual Buddha has to declare you a bodhisatta. You can't just decide to be one. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from 8 Precept Erawan. And 8 Precept Erawan says, are there any Buddhist holidays unique to Burma? And I don't think so. I did mention earlier on, towards the beginning of this Q&A, that the last day of the Rains Retreat is called Abhidhamma Day, in celebration of the Buddha coming down from heaven after teaching Abhidhamma in heaven to the goddess that used to be his mother and to the other gods and goddesses there. Whether in other countries, like in Thailand, the last day of the Rains Retreat is called Abhidhamma Day, I don't know. Abhidhamma Nate. But really, I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, you got Buddha Day, the full moon of what is usually May. Sometimes it can be at the end of April. Usually it's the full moon of May, as Buddha Day, celebration of the Buddha's enlightenment. But that's going to be common throughout any Theravada Buddhist country. And I mean, there's really not a whole lot of Buddhist holidays in Burma, other than just the standard, like the beginning of the Rains Retreat, the end of the Rains Retreat, Buddha Day. You've got the month after the end of the Rains Retreat, the full moon, which is the Festival of Lights, which is common to other Buddhist countries. I think it's originated in India or something. So I'm not aware of any Buddhist holidays that are unique to Burma, unless I'm just not thinking of it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Jules. And Jules asks a question which was just, it was like a screenshot of a post on X by Bronze Age Pervert. And Bronze Age Pervert says, question that I've been pondering for over 10 years. I can make myself ejaculate purely by will, without any physical stimulation, purely from mental concentration. Is it then also possible to make yourself die, again without any physical means, but purely by focus? And I would guess that a very advanced, adept yogi might be able to just think himself dead. But I don't think the average person could do that. I don't think someone who really did not have pretty much of a superhuman attainment in samadhi could do such a thing. Because, I mean, once you become unconscious, I mean, you could like hold your breath or something. I mean, even that wouldn't be purely mental. But once you pass out, then you're just automatically going to start breathing again. So, yeah, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that like an extremely adept meditation master might be able to just think himself dead. But I'm not sure about that. I can't think of any example of that other than like an early episode of Star Trek, which doesn't really count. And even he'd stayed dead for a very short time and then came back alive again. So, let's see. Is it then also possible to make yourself die, again without any physical measure, but purely by focus? Well, I mean, the one case I could think of is someone who is badly injured, and then they can just give up and die. Or if they have like a tenacious life force and just refuse, then they can will themselves not to die. So, I mean, in a case like that, that would be like some kind of sort of fringe example, I guess, that certainly mental states would be different. Well, I mean, they would be the determining factor on whether you live or die. But if you're perfectly healthy, let's say you've got the meditation master who's perfectly healthy and just decides it's time to die, whether he could will himself dead or not. I've never heard of a case of it. I assume that it's possible because just about anything is possible. But whether it's ever actually happened or not, I would guess that it actually has. But I can't really be sure. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. And PSA says, what is the oldest a person can be and still be allowed to ordain in Theravada? And I don't think there is a maximum age limit. So you could be 110 years old and still be ordained as a monk, although preferably you should still be able-bodied and able to like do your duties as a monk instead of being on your deathbed and ordained that way. The only maximum age limit thing I can think of in Theravada is that there is a rule of monastic discipline that you're not allowed to become a preceptor or a teacher if you are feeble with old age. But there is no limit that I know of with regard to a maximum age for being ordained. There's not even a rule against being ordained when you're feeble. It's just that you can't take on the duties of being a preceptor or a teacher if you are so old that you are just feeble, decrepit, so to speak. So I think I answered that one. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Arain. And Arain says, as a biologist and also a former Buddhist monastic, how do each of those schools answer the origin of life question? Well, I'll start off with the Buddhism. How do each of these schools answer the origin of life question? In Buddhism, there is no origin of life, really. That samsara has existed forever. And so life, like conscious beings, have existed forever. With regard to life on this earth, on the other hand, they have a kind of cosmological explanation where, first of all, the previous cosmos, the previous universe, at least the astronomical universe, has been destroyed by a cataclysm, like generally like this universal firestorm that wipes out all physical matter, and then the new universe has to re-evolve. And the first thing that appears is the throne of Brahma, and this is all generated by karma. So the entire universe isn't generated by any kind of physical force like the Big Bang, like in science, but it's a manifestation of consciousness. Karma is a mental state, and it's karma that starts causing this entire universe to re-evolve. And so you got the throne of Brahma, and then the Maha Brahma of this world system appears just through the force of karma. It's like he's reborn from this higher formless realm into this world of form. And he starts getting lonely because he's all there all by himself. And right around the time that he starts feeling lonely, more beings start appearing around him. And then he thinks that his own desire caused them to appear. And so he starts thinking that he's like a capital G God. But with regard to life on this earth, the way the Buddhists explained it in ancient India is that we started off as essentially gods, and we have been degenerating instead of evolving up from pond slime, that we are degenerating from gods. So at first we lived astronomically long lifespans, and we didn't have to eat food. And we were just like living on light, and we were essentially godlike beings living in a kind of heaven realm. And then gradually we started to degenerate. Some proto-human god found it was sort of like this manna on the ground. They kind of scooped some up and started eating it, and then it just kind of caused us to become more crude and coarse and more dependent upon physical food. And then gradually we'll get to the point where the lifespan is only like 7 years, and we'll all be like cannibalizing each other and so forth. And then it starts going back up again. But essentially, the Buddhist explanation of the origin of life is that it is generated by karma. Ultimately, it has no beginning. And when like a new material universe has to re-evolve after the previous one was destroyed, it's like the karma of it's the mental states of the beings that are going to be reborn into this world that cause these new beings to start arising. At first they'd have to arise just spontaneously, like in heaven realms, upper heaven realms, where you don't have to have a mother, you're not born from a womb, you just appear spontaneously. So with regard to biology, the origin of life question, some biologists just try to kick the can down the road and say it was spores from outer space, but that doesn't explain where those spores came. What was the origin of the first spore? So when I was in college and we were learning I took a class in organic evolution, and we had a few weeks at least on the origin of life theoretically. And the biological explanation is that the primordial earth, the atmosphere was mostly volcanic gases, a lot of hydrogen and stuff. There was no free oxygen, lots of lightning, lots of like gamma rays and just intense radiation. There was no ozone layer yet. And so you had like methane and ammonia and all these various water, clearly, and just the radiation and the lightning and so forth would cause especially like carboxylic acids to appear spontaneously. They've reproduced this under laboratory conditions, that you can get very simple polypeptides, like the precursor of a protein, just appearing through electricity, going through the theorized primordial atmosphere of the earth. And that some skeptics will argue, well, that same electricity from the lightning bolts and so forth will just break up anything once it starts getting complicated. So then they have to further theorize that these polypeptide chains would then sink deeper into the water, or they get buried in mud or something, where they're just somehow you'd eventually, over the course of millions of years, you'd wind up with a self-replicating peptide chain, like a primitive protein, like an enzyme that catalyzes its own reproduction. And that would be like the first proto-life would be like a simple protein chain that is an enzyme that catalyzes its like reproduction of the same kind of protein chain. And then you get into the question of, where cell membranes came from. And I remember when I was in that class, I did we all had to do like an oral presentation, and I did mine on like the origin of cell membranes from just like lipid molecules that would form just spontaneously into clumps. And so, I mean, from the biological point of view, you start off with the primordial atmosphere of methane and ammonia and various gases and lots of water. As soon as the earth cools down enough to have liquid water, you've got liquid water. And then it was just sort of radiation and lightning that would cause more complex organic molecules to arise. And then eventually, over millions of years, eventually you'd wind up through random chance, presumably, of one of these protein chains being able to catalyze its own reproduction. And so the first like genetic material would have been a protein, and then somehow through mutations and just various random trial and errors, you wind up with nucleic acids taking over as the genetic material in life. But there is some evidence anyway that it started off as a protein thing, that the first life was, or the first proto-life was a kind of self-replicating protein. And it would be a sort of like the entire pond. You'd have like the organic soup of the primordial oceans, or maybe more likely like a pond on land, like that would just become like this protoplasmic substance. It'd be mostly water, of course, but it would be like this organic soup where all these reactions were able to like take place, pretty much at random, until finally you wind up with cell membranes and so forth, that you wind up with the first very primitive anaerobic bacteria, the archaebacteria, which still exist, but free oxygen is toxic to them because they originally evolved before there was free oxygen in the atmosphere. So, I mean, I can accept a kind of combination of these two for the origin of life on this earth. Forget other planets, previous universes and so forth. On this planet, that I do think that karma does exist. I am a Buddhist after all. And so I think that there is truth and validity from a samsaric, objective, empirical point of view to the idea that evolution occurs, more or less Darwinian fashion. But I can also accept that to some degree it's also guided by mind, because mind is the forerunner. It's all made of mind. So mind would have to be like a central feature in even organic evolution along Darwinian lines, that still there can be mind that is guiding it consciously or just subconsciously. Sort of, it could be like this blind will that Schopenhauer talked about. Or there could be like some higher entity, like in 2001 A Space Odyssey kind of a thing. But I don't think that ultimately the Buddhist idea and the empirical biological idea are in conflict, other than just the whole cosmological, mythological idea that we started off as gods with astronomical lifespans, feeding on light, and that we degenerated down into human status, because it's pretty obvious to me that we are evolved from more simple primate mammals. That was one thing I really liked in Burma, was the tree shrews. Tree shrews are very common. They're called shint swait in Burma. They look like a squirrel, which is a shint in Burmese, but they're not squirrels. They look like a squirrel, but they're not a squirrel, because they're very primitive, like a proto-primate. And they feed on insects, and they've got a long snout like a shrew. and they make this whirring noise instead of chattering like squirrels. And it just seemed like grandpa. They got ears that looked like human ears on this little squirrel-like thing. And then, when I was a kid, they were considered to be the most primitive of all primates, although now they're in their own order. Rather, they're not primates anymore. They're like an intermediate stage between like insectivores like shrews and the actual prosimians like lemurs or tarsiers or something. But I do think that karma definitely is playing a role in evolution, that it is helping to guide evolution, even though you can't explain it in mechanistic terms like Darwin did. But still, there's no reason why you cannot have like karmic forces that are influencing evolution. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is the last question. So we're kind of short on this. This is way less than 3 hours. And remember, the next Q&A is probably going to be a live stream. So you may, if you're confident in my capacity to do live streams this time, you may save your questions until then, or you can leave them in the comments below. It's your call. But this is the very last question. This is from Dhamma River. And this is in response to the little video I did on Zen koans, which was the video I did previous to this one. And he says, would you know if the ordination lineage of Zen Buddhism can be traced back to the Buddha, or is this an ordination lineage that got started up later on? I would assume that the ordination lineage of pretty much all schools of Buddhism can be traced all the way back to the Buddha. It may be that there's some school of like Mahayana Buddhism that was started by like unordained people, started off by lay people, and then they just kind of set up their own ordination lineage later. They just started to, let's just make monks from this, non-monastic tradition, and this kind of started off some new tradition that way. But I don't think Zen was that way. I don't even think Pure Land Buddhism started off as like unordained people that then just created their own monastic tradition from scratch that didn't have a succession going from the Buddha until now. I mean, according to Zen tradition, Mahakassapa was like the first patriarch of Zen, if you don't include the Buddha himself as the first patriarch of Zen. And then you just had like early schools of Buddhism, which includes Theravada, Sarvastivada, the Mahasangika schools, and so forth. And then, some of them are just kind of evolving, farther and farther in a Mahayanist tradition. And then eventually they just wound up being called Zen. I don't think that they would be considered fully ordained from an orthodox, strict, like monastic discipline perspective in Theravada, because their tradition, their ordination procedure is very unlikely to be considered a valid ordination procedure according to the rules of monastic discipline in Theravada Buddhism. So, I mean, that's like, for me, the nail in the coffin for the people saying that the Bhikkhuni ordinations are valid because it's based on like a Taiwanese or Korean tradition of nuns that had a ordination tradition going back to the Buddha, going back to the first nuns, because the ordination itself would not be considered valid. It's not done in accordance with how an ordination has to be done according to the ancient rules of monastic discipline. So the ordination lineage, such as it is, it'd be valid from the Zen point of view, but it wouldn't be valid from an older ancient Indian point of view, because they probably left behind the Indian languages. They probably left behind even the precise words of the ceremony of ordination, so that it would just be invalid. It wouldn't be a correct and valid ordination from an earlier ancient Indian point of view. But still, you can say that the ordination lineage, such as it is in Zen Buddhism, probably goes all the way back to the Buddha. Probably all of the schools of Buddhism, it was just monks ordaining monks, which ordain monks, which ordain monks. And it might be that the way they're going about it is changing and diverging and deviating from the original model. But still, it is a continuous tradition that's going and changing and evolving until you finally wind up, 1,000 years later or more than 1,000 years later as Zen or Chan or Jhana Buddhism or whatever. Whenever you want to say that Zen Buddhism began, what is the origin of Zen Buddhism? It's hard to say, really. I don't know if anyone could really say it. It'd probably be before Bodhidharma, so it'd start in India as Jhana Buddhism, but exactly what school that would have been, I don't know. Like, what school of Buddhism did Bodhidharma, what was he ordained in? I don't know. So, Dhamma River, would you know if the ordination lineage of Zen Buddhism can be traced back to the Buddha? Or is this an ordination lineage that got started up later on? I would guess that it can be traced back to the Buddha, even though by ancient Indian standards, it would no longer be considered a valid ordination tradition in accordance with the rules of monastic discipline. But even so, it was just monks starting in the Buddha's time that just kept, ordaining and producing more disciples, which then ordained their own disciples, which ordained their own disciples. And even though they might have drifted away from orthodoxy or what would be considered a valid ordination by orthodox standards, still it was, people dressed as monks, doing the ceremonies to ordain until they finally wound up with like Japanese Zen. That would be my guess. I can't prove any of it. And that's it. That was the last question. And so, like I already said, if you have any questions, no more than 3 per episode, please, or you may be severely punished, especially when Trump gets his fascist regime installed. People start being lined up against the wall. Bear that in mind. No more than 3 questions per episode. And if it's about something you think I can answer, early Buddhism, obviously, Theravada Buddhism, Buddhism in general, maybe like Indian philosophy, Eastern philosophy, even to some degree Western philosophy, meditation, monastic discipline, Burma, that kind of thing, the origin of life from a biological point of view, that kind of thing. I might be able to answer that. I'll at least give it a shot. And if I don't know the answer, I'll admit to not knowing the answer and just move on to the next question. Check out the URL links, smash that like button, and subscribe if you have not done so already. And be happy.